Barbara Holt explained that as a child and adolescent in the 1950s and early 1960s, she found it a very special occasion to go to the downtown movie palaces. It was just a special occasion to go downtown, period. But racism affected this experience for many African Americans, for many black Chicagoans. Barbara Holt remembered that, quote, as a person who was African American, my experience in the Loop in general was one that was always colored by uncertainty about the reception that one would receive, perhaps so more in the department stores, especially Marshall Field's, and the restaurants than the theaters. But the Loop was experiencing rapidly changing racial dynamics in this period, and business interests began to mobilize both economically and politically in order to protect their interests. Because Chicago's major first-run motion picture theaters were located in the Loop, they were the first to screen these movies. So it meant that if you were an urban patron, you better see them right away. Now, in this study, I argue that motion picture theaters in the Loop played a very pivotal role in the later stages of the civil rights movement. As African Americans began to gain legal rights in the courts and through Congress, they began to contest other barriers. As Barbara Holt's comment indicates, the Loop was still regarded as a white space. Following the King assassination, though, young African Americans began to ignore that unspoken designation. Motion picture theaters were one of the primary sites of entertainment in Chicago's Loop. Increasingly, African Americans began to attend theaters there and claimed certain venues, primarily the Roosevelt Theater and the Oriental Theater, as black spaces. As larger numbers of black Chicagoans began to frequent these theaters, owners and programmers began to notice the expansion of black audiences. Hollywood also began to discover this African American audience in the late 60s and early 1970s, and the studios began to produce and release black-themed and black-cast films. Black Chicago audiences reacted enthusiastically, often breaking box office records in theaters that screen films that cater to African American audiences. So if you're a programmer, somebody who actually books movies for theaters, you had a tough decision to make. Do you screen a black-themed film and possibly alienate white moviegoers? Or do you attempt to feature mainstream white-dominated fare that might appeal only to white filmgoers and perhaps maybe attract some African Americans as well? I argue that black-themed motion pictures in the early 1970s in the Loop were an important part of this consciousness raising at the later stages of the civil rights movement. As black-themed motion pictures played to primarily African American audiences in the Loop, several theaters became known as black social spaces, and black moviegoers started a call and response type of relationship with what was taking place on the screen. As black cinematic figures became heroic, challenging a racist system, taking matters into their own hands, using violence to get their way, and objecting to racialized stereotypes on the screen, black Chicagoans began to react very affirmatively. Not all black Chicagoans were happy about this new screen fare, though. A segment of the African American community in Chicago led the anti-blaxploitation movement, and their impact was national in scope. However, their voices often went unheeded as literally throngs, tens of thousands of African American youth began to attend these movies between 1970 and 1975. Now, the sight of thousands of young black Chicagoans attending movies and socializing in the Loop terrified the white business establishment in the downtown region. Aided by the dominant white press, the Loop increasingly began to be portrayed as a dangerous area that was criminal and essentially black. The business elite, therefore, worked with the administration of Mayor Richard J. Daley to alleviate this problem. Urban renewal and redevelopment became code buzzwords as business interests in the Loop began an organized campaign to eliminate these entertainment zones, driving the motion picture theaters of the Loop out of existence. The physical deterioration of these structures, declining attendance, and the concerted effort upon the part of business leaders eventually doomed these theaters, and the majority of them were razed by the end of the 1980s. Now, when I was completing this study, I interviewed literally dozens of Chicagoans who attended motion picture theaters in the Loop during this period. I approached each interview with a very standardized set of questions, but I often found the stories that they were telling about these theaters and these audiences to be more intriguing and compelling than the questions I may have asked. All right, for example, one thing everybody said all the time was that there would be often rats that would be crawling all around the floor, all right, which you can imagine going to a movie and having that happen. My good friend Myrna Lovejoy said something to me in the middle of an interview that just literally knocked my socks off. She was talking about growing up black in Chicago in the 1950s in Englewood, and she said, for whatever reason, I did not feel the world was mine. And that just hit me in my core, because Myrna was one of those loving, caring people that I know of. And as I started to interview more people, I realized there was still a lot of sorrow and anger and heartache and pride and humor that were often a lot of their responses. So I thought, this is an important part of history that has not been addressed before, and I need to try to address this. Now, I want to show you some slides here, right? Just to show you some movie theaters that existed. This was the Woods movie theater. This had the reputation of being a theater that showed lots of like action-adventure films. If you were going to see a James Bond movie in the 1960s or 1970s, this is one of the theaters that you would go to. Now, certainly racial politics played a very important role in the changing racial dynamics. I think you need to know a little bit about what the Loop was like and the way that racial politics played out in Chicago during this period of time. Adam Cohen and Elizabeth Taylor point out in their biography of Chicago Mayor Richard Daley that, quote, though the Loop was in serious decline in the 1950s, it had a powerful ally on its side, Chicago's business establishment. 54 of the Fortune 500 companies were located in the Chicago area in the 1950s, and many of these were located in or near the Loop. Now, race and economics became very linked in Chicago's downtown. The Loop was still not racially integrated in the 1950s because many businesses refused to employ African Americans. Other establishments, primarily hotels and restaurants, went out of their way to provide inferior service or to inflict racial slights to African American patrons, letting them know that they were really not welcome there. Joe Rucklick, who was a resident of Evanston in the 1950s, said, you didn't see black people walking around the Loop during that time. Thomas Sugri has argued what made northern racial barriers so frustrating was that they were sometimes as hard and fast as they were in the South, but at the same time they could be surprising and unpredictably flexible. The rules of racial engagement in the North were seldom posted. This was certainly the case in the Loop, where black citizens in the 1950s and 1960s would take a chance when they were attempting to buy a meal or reserve a room at a Loop establishment. As to compare the segregation of Chicago and Atlanta in this period, Milton Davis, an activist in CORE, told an interviewer, well, surely Chicago was as racist as Atlanta, and certainly in terms of its brutality towards blacks, not physical brutality, just I think what it did to the psyche. Maybe this is because one assumed that in the North you had these freedoms only to find out that that wasn't true, that that wasn't a fact. Davis explained that when entertainers like Duke Ellington and Sarah Vaughan came to perform in Chicago in the 1940s and 1950s, they had to stay at Bronzeville. The first time that I have found Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. actually staying in a hotel in the Loop was, I think he stayed in a Hilton in 1963. And that's the earliest occasion, you know, and that's the best-known African-American man in the country in 1963. So an ordinary person still in 1963 was not going to get a room. Earl Strayhorn, who was an attorney who served on the Chicago Civil Rights Commission, claimed there was as much racism in the Loop as there was in Deerfield. The pioneering civil rights activist Tim Ewell Black said, going to the Loop was a challenge. We knew we were going to be insulted. Christopher Reed, a professor at Roosevelt University, recalled going to Loop movie theaters as a child in the 1950s and seeing very few black adults at weekend screenings. He explained that African Americans who were part of the workforce on the streets in the Loop during the week literally vanished from the Loop at night. So it was very much a differential there too. Now, there was a tremendous change that began to take place demographically in the Chicago region between the 1950s and 1960s. Let me just give you one statistic. Between 1950 and 1960, the black population of Chicago rose from 492,000 to 812,000. Okay? So that's like a 75% increase in only a 10-year period of time. But the 1950s, and this is very nicely portrayed in Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun, was still a time of tremendous housing segregation. And the Black Belt, the area that was in the South Side that was largely restricted where African Americans could live, was literally bursting at the seams. The Chicago racial frontier, therefore, started to have changing borders in the 1950s. White Chicagoans began to flee to the suburbs, and the African American population began to increase exponentially. So what you're going to find is, with this tremendous increase, there was a need for people to stay. The white business establishment, which was very economically and politically powerful, became increasingly frightened by these changing racial patterns. The business community's fear was that the encroaching black ghetto would scare off potential wealthy clientele. Suburbanization and the white fear of having black neighbors led to several now illegal practices by real estate agents. Blockbusting, a practice in which real estate agents and developers would encourage white property owners to sell by giving them the impression that African Americans were moving into the neighborhood, became increasingly common in Chicago in the 1950s and 1960s. The white business establishment feared that if there was a tidal wave of poor blacks and they moved into the region, that their investments would suddenly depreciate and dramatically go down. This process of racial succession created desperation and fear among white Chicagoans in changing neighborhoods. Unscrupulous speculators would use all types of techniques to try to drive out white neighbors, including hiring African Americans to walk through neighborhoods or honk horns at night. Whites began to therefore see themselves as victims of black territorial expansion. Those who did not sell often resorted to violence. And one of the supposed nonviolent solutions was urban renewal. Now, the expansion of the Black Belt coincided with the physical deterioration of the Loop. Many of the aging buildings that we're going to find in the Loop in the 1950s and 1960s had been around since the late 19th century. So, unless you're going to look at it in terms of kind of historical restoration, some of these buildings probably did need to go. The Loop also had political and symbolic significance for the civil rights movement in black Chicagoans. There were a host of key civil rights events that took place within the Loop between 1963 and 1968. It was an important location for demonstration and political activism. There were sit-ins, for example, all over downtown Loop in the middle of the streets, like what you saw following Ferguson in 1963, 1964, largely to protest the segregation that took place within schools. The first major event is when, in 1963, the NAACP had its national convention in Chicago, and they called for a march through the Loop. They ended in a rally in Grant Park, and Mayor Daley was later booed at a picnic in that park. And so it's interesting. Now, this is a particular shot following the King murder. In 1968, this had a devastating impact upon the city of Chicago. Both dramatic and demographic changes occurred because of the racial riots that took place after the assassination. The sheer physical destruction was immense. Much of what burnt down between April 5th of 1968 and April 8th of 1968 was never rebuilt. Entire blocks lay empty. Even store and restaurant owners that did not suffer the wrath of looters and arsonists boarded up their establishments, never to open again. The riots also dramatically changed the racial balance of the city. Very few white neighborhoods were impacted by the riots, but white Chicagoans were scared. You could see the fires from the Gold Coast and the near west suburbs. Frantic individuals called the police and fire departments, sure that their neighborhood was going to be the next that was going to be burned down. Psychological barriers began to fall in the late 1960s and early 1970s because of the King assassination and the riots, and because of the rise of black pride. The Black Power movement and years of frustration over segregation began to change as African Americans began freely moving about the city. As the 1970s began, new patterns of geographic occupation, brought primarily through the patronizing of entertainment venues, specifically motion picture theaters, began to embolden Black Chicagoans. The early 1970s was a time of great change for the city of Chicago, and this was reflected in the Loop as thousands of Black Chicagoans began to defy previous racial prescriptions and began to carve out entertainment choices for themselves. I'm going to argue that going to a movie theater when you were Black in the late 60s and early 70s was literally a political act, right? Because you were going somewhere in which your parents or your grandparents might not feel welcome or might not feel safe prior to that time. So it was literally kind of claiming a space as your own. Now, I'd like to kind of do the rest of this, kind of show you just some slides and kind of talk over these slides as we're going on. This is another shot of the Woods Theater. This is the Clark Theater. Now here's an interesting question about the notion of the Loop being an occupied space. I tried to interview as many different groups of people as possible, racially, ethnically, every way possible. And one thing that I decided to do was I went to a senior citizens center in Boys Town and interviewed a group of gay senior citizens. And one of the things, literally every person to the T told me, you know, the Clark Theater is where we met each other, right? In the 1940s and 1950s, when in many ways it was still illegal to be gay, the Clark Theater had a repertory theater. They would show old movies, and old movies would change every day. And so that literally became an occupied space for gay and lesbian people. Anybody recognize this? The Michael Todd Theater and then the Cinestage Theater. Know what this is now? I know most of you heard of it. That's the Goodman Theater. Okay? You can kind of see it now. Right? The Michael Todd Theater was actually owned by Elizabeth Taylor's ex-husband. And this showed movies really all the way through the 1980s. But notice it's right next door to the Cinestage. You know, just kind of an interesting subject. One of the things about the early 1970s is a lot of these theater owners and distributors were trying to do anything to bring in audiences. And sometimes the decisions that they made were just absolutely asinine. For example, I know the Michael Todd Theater one week showed an X-rated movie. And then the next week, they showed the G-rated Benji. Now, are you going to take your 7-year-old to a movie theater that just showed X-rated movies the weekend before? Probably not, all right? Benji didn't do very well either. I looked at the box office take. Okay, I'm sure you're probably familiar with this theater too, the Oriental Theater. And the Oriental Theater and the Roosevelt Theater were the two theaters that really gained the reputation quite early of being African-American spaces. And I'm going to show you why in just a few minutes. Of course, it looks different today. And then the Chicago Theater, which is probably, you know, kept and embodied the most of kind of what it is today. This was kind of the last holdout theater that did not show African-American themed movies. This was part of the ABC Great States chain. It was actually owned by the ABC Network. And this was kind of considered to be their flagship theater. So this was the last theater that showed African-American screen movies. Okay, here's an example of a movie that really began to change things quite dramatically. This was a movie called Tick, Tick, Tick that came out in 1970 that starred Jim Brown. Anybody know who Jim Brown was? Football player, all right? Early 1970s was a period of time in which a lot of professional athletes, all right, and then ended up becoming movie stars also. This was kind of a take on In the Heat of the Night, all right? Kind of a version of that. Again, it came out in 1970. It's interesting, it showed at the Roosevelt Theater. The Roosevelt Theater was the first theater in Chicago to gain the reputation of being an African-American theater, and that's because they actually employed African-American people. So it was a place that African-American audiences would often frequent. This movie did very well when it was released, and suddenly the Roosevelt management began to understand that maybe there was a large black audience there that was not being tapped. Jim Brown went out to make other movies. All right? This is kind of a lower version of this. Jim Brown takes on Karate Killers and Slaughter's big ripoff. Okay, this is the movie that changed everything, though. All right, in terms of kind of the history of the way that the loop was considered. Sweetback's Badass Song is considered to be one of the path-breaking films in black independent filmmaking. It's been called revolutionary, pornographic, reactionary, landmark, trash, all right? It's often considered the film that triggered the explosion of blaxploitation movies in the period between 1971 and 1973. It's also considered to be a film that's an example of grassroots black power, but this is displayed in artistic form. The stellar success of Sweetback at the box office awakened independent film producers and a struggling Hollywood studio system to the existence that there was a large African-American audience out there and that they were largely being ignored by filmmakers. Sweetback's low production costs and staggering box office take also proved to producers that they could make substantial amounts of ticket sales to the African-American movie-going community. Now, this is something that a lot of film scholars know about. What they don't know about is the impact of this revolutionary film on localized audience in theaters. As thousands of young African Americans began to flock to the Oriental Theater to see Sweetback, theater managers in the Loop quickly began to recognize the potential profit from black theme or black starring films. This meant that Sweetback's Badass Song had a tremendous impact upon the racialized nature of moviegoing in the city of Chicago. I literally argue that if you're talking about the Loop, you can call it BS or AS, before Sweetback or after Sweetback, because this movie made so much money that everybody in the Loop started to look at films like it in order to bring in large audiences. Now, this is not something you take your mom to. The film actually centered on a sex performer who was played as an adult by Van Peebles on the run from the law. In the film's opening scenes, there's depictions of Sweetback's childhood, scenes in which he's running away from law enforcement. As an adult, Sweetback is actually working as a sexual performer in a sex show. Now, he's apolitical in the beginning of the film. In fact, he's almost entirely silent and non-emotional. But Sweetback witnesses police brutality towards a young black radical, and he murders a racist cop in defense. By jeopardizing his life, he literally breaks out of his social passivity and becomes a political outlaw. He's on the lam for the rest of the film, fleeing from South Central Los Angeles, eventually attempting to get to Mexico. A black anti-hero, Sweetback does what's necessary to survive, including performing sexually with a female motorcycle gang leader, stabbing white cops, biting the head off a lizard, anything he's got to do to survive. Sweetback is chased by hunting dogs, but finally makes it across the Rio Grande River at Tijuana. Van Peebles said, "I wanted to have a victorious film." So in the end, the African-American anti-hero, I should say, eventually does get away. Now, Sweetback opened at the Oriental Theater in the Loop during the first full week of May of 1971. The theater was independent. It was not associated with any real chain. And the film was an obvious commercial success in its first couple of weeks of release. Now, this is particularly striking considering the fact, I don't think you can see it here, that the movie was rated X. Right? We don't have any movies that kind of do that well that are X. In 1971, if you wanted to get a rating from the Motion Picture Association of America, you had to submit a film to their jury. Producers who did not submit their film to their jury got an automatic X. Well, Van Peebles decided, the director of the film, not to submit his movie because he thought this is an all-white group. They're not going to understand my film. And so he didn't submit it. And so this actually worked in his favor because he began to advertise rated X by an all-white jury. Jack Valeni, who was the president of the MPA at the time, told Van Peebles, "You couldn't advertise this type of line." And then Van Peebles asked Valenti, well, your jury's all white, isn't it? Well, of course it was, all right? And the controversy actually helped fuel the box office as a result of this. Now, this was a turning point in the history of the Oriental Theater. It had been one of the most popular movie palaces in the late 60s and early 70s. It was home to the Chicago premiere at the airport in 1970, and this widely popular film showed there for almost 3 months. Sweetback, though, changed the reputation of the theater. As John Sanchez notes in a comment on the website Cinema Treasures, the theater got the stigma of playing only to African American audiences, and whites began to stay away in droves. Well, Sweetback's enormous box office success led to a two-month run at the Oriental Theater. And many younger African American moviegoers spurred the film to tremendous financial success. So in a very short amount of time, the Oriental gains its reputation of being a black space, and white audience members began to stay away from the theater from that point on. Well, word of mouth among young African American moviegoers began to precipitate a firestorm of controversy. That led to a lot of great money for the Oriental, but not all black Chicagoans were happy with the enormous success of the film. And criticism of Sweetback first began as filmgoers and parents began to question the politics of the film itself, and then began to write sporadic letters to the editor and commentary to the press. Now, the leaders of this movement are this husband and wife team, Francis and Val Gray Ward. This is Val Gray and this is Francis. Francis, they're both still alive today. They're quite elderly. Francis was a longtime journalist in Chicago. Val Gray Ward was an actor for a long period of time. And in the late 1960s, they established an organization that was called Kuumba, K-U-U-M-B-A. This was a South Side Black arts organization. It was founded in 1968, and it took the lead in condemning the film. Kuumba was a leading actor in the black arts movement and was dedicated to, quote, contributing to the black liberation struggle through creative expression. The workshop attempted to try to create an all-inclusive arts organization with a wide range of activities that would focus primarily on the production of live theater. But Kuumba also became the primary black organization in Chicago to take on black-themed motion pictures. They began to publicly criticize movies that they considered to be racially insensitive. Now, Kuumba took a grassroots approach when it came to fighting what they believed were exploited motion pictures, often by picketing and staging protests in front of theaters that showed these movies. But the group also drafted very sophisticated political position papers that laid out the group's objections in certain motion pictures. These papers, I argue, are very important cultural documents of the time because they demonstrate that black support for blaxploitation movies, movies like Sweetback, was not universal. Now, members of Kuumba's board of directors was pretty prestigious. It included the historian Lerone Bennett Jr., the poet Gwendolyn Brooks, the editor and theoretician of the black arts movement Hoyt Fuller, but the position papers were largely drawn up by these two individuals. And so what happens is Chicago really becomes the leader in critiquing and considering the politics and perhaps the racial dangers of movies like Sweetback. And that's something that's been left out of the history books. You often talk about, for example, Lerone Bennett Jr., the historian, wrote an article in Ebony Magazine in November of 1971 called The Emancipation Orgasm, all right, where he argued that there was no political value in Sweetback whatsoever. Well, he wrote this in November, and he largely borrowed a lot of the words and a lot of the phrasing of these two individuals. So Chicago really becomes the leader in critiquing a lot of the messages that were there on the screen. That's Melvin Van Peebles. All right. You're probably more familiar with this movie, Shaft. All right? It was also a really important film in terms of changing the racial tide of a lot of movie theaters. Shaft appeared at the Roosevelt Theater, and the Roosevelt had a very aggressive motion picture advertising campaign to market the film. For example, you could go to the first screening of Shaft at 8:45 in the morning, right? And the last one was actually a midnight show. Shaft broke all records at the Roosevelt Box Office Theater when it first was released in July of 1971. So no movie had grossed more than Shaft when it was first released, demonstrating the importance of African American audiences at that point. The film continued its remarkable box office success at the theater throughout July and August of 1971. I mean, Shaft is making more money in its 6th week of release than all the other films that were released for the first time that week, demonstrating how important that it was. Another controversial film, okay? Superfly. There were 2 significant movies that came out in 1972 in the Loop in Chicago. One of them, Superfly, it's the other one, The Godfather. The movies literally grossed the same amount of money. Nobody would ever know that. This did tremendous box office when it first came out at the Oriental Theater. It grossed $150,000 in each of its first 2 weeks of release. A lot of money at a movie theater in 1972 would have been like $40,000. So it's making a tremendous amount of money. It is making the comparable amount of money that The Godfather was. This film also set off a firestorm of controversy, and Kumba began its second large organized campaign to try to shut down this movie because they considered it offensive because Superfly's a drug dealer. Okay. You can see the publicity. One of the things that's interesting about African American themed movies in the Loop in the early 1970s, 2 things. First off, soundtracks for blaxploitation films were enormously popular. Sometimes they were more popular than the actual film itself. Superfly's soundtrack was done by Curtis Mayfield. It's considered one of the classics of the early 1970s. And often when you would go to one of these movies, you would get like a free album as you would go in. So that was like a real cool thing. Another thing is that at these movies, as opposed to white dominant movies, the stars actually showed up. And so that was something that was very attractive to African American audiences. You could see the producer, the director, the writer, the stars of the film, and even some really big individuals like Richard Roundtree, who was in Shaft. You also see that racial politics even begins to permeate pornography in the 1970s. Hollywood had fallen upon very hard times by the early 1970s, and we're going to show that a lot of movie theaters in the Loop that had shown standard fare before the 1960s resorted to pornography because they thought that that was the only thing that they could possibly sell. That also began to change the reputation of a lot of movie theaters because they would often alternate between a pornographic film, an X-rated film, and then a black-themed film. Well, you know, if you're a white mother from Naperville, you're probably not going to be going to that movie theater anymore, right? It's not going to have anything that you're really going to be attracted to. So that became the reputation of a movie theater that was kind of not somewhere you would want to go anymore. And the CineStage was a perfect example of that. Pam Grier. Okay. As you notice here, Pam Grier, who was the major female box office star in the early 1970s, literally could bring tens of thousands of audience members to a theater if she appeared. She was a tremendous star, and she was such a big star that if you look, this movie actually appeared at the Chicago Theater, which was the last holdout theater to show black-themed films. But Pam Grier was such a draw that even she began to break that barrier. Often successful black-themed films would show for weeks, if not months. Claudine is an example of that. When it was released in 1974, it played in one movie theater, another in the Loop for literally 6 months. So these are examples of films that have legs, all right? It meant that audience members were willing to go back maybe multiple times in order to try to see it. In 1973, there started to be a change in the dynamics of movies in the Loop, and that was the introduction of kung fu movies to the Loop. And this was something that was kind of mystifying for a number of producers and distributors because they had not recognized that there was a large built-in African-American audience for these types of movies. This was probably the biggest film that there was in 1973 in the Loop. Enter the Dragon, starring Bruce Lee. Right? This is the last movie that he's going to make before he dies. Enormously popular. It was grossing $200,000 a week in the Loop, unheard of amounts of money. And so very quickly in a lot of these theaters, they reverted from black-themed films to theaters that involved some type of martial arts. Although if you were really successful, if you could work in both. For example, here in the upper right-hand portion, you see Jim Kelly posters. Jim Kelly was an African-American martial artist. So here you were able to appeal to a couple of different things. It was interesting because when I was researching this a couple of summers ago, I was at the Carter G. Woodson Library on 95th Street on the south side. And it's largely an African-American library. And I saw all these kids with their laptops with Bruce Lee kind of stickers all over them. So I thought it was interesting that even now that correlation hasn't necessarily changed. Gene Siskel, again, if you're probably under 40, you don't know who this is. Gene Siskel is the one columnist and writer during this period of time that I talk about the most because he was often very graphic, kind of very bold in what he often wrote about when he was talking about the fact that sometimes he was the only white audience member that was sitting in a theater. And he talked about the fact that he often would slump down in the chair and put his coat over his head. He talked also about putting his feet up on the seat because he didn't want the rats to get to him. Right? But he talked about the level of uncomfortability that a number of white audience members began to have as young African-American people would interact with the screen, all right, yell back, call back at the screen, and that as a white audience member, that often made him very nervous. This is also a movie that changed everything. Right? First-run movies always came to the Loop. Right? That was just the rule. The Exorcist was the first movie that did not do that. When The Exorcist was released in 1974, it went to 2 suburban movie theaters in Chicago. Now, why don't you think any of the downtown movie theaters would show The Exorcist? Why do you think it wouldn't be released there? Maybe a Christian population? That's a good answer. Because it didn't have any black people in it, all right? And everybody knew that black people only went to movies that had black people in it. There was some dumb thinking back then, all right? And those theater owners who did not show The Exorcist were going to regret it for the rest of 1974. Because literally in January and February of 1974, 1975, I messed it up now. You had to wait in line, hundreds and hundreds of people in order to get in one of these theaters. And The Exorcist did not premiere at a Loop theater until it had already run at these suburban theaters for 2 months. This began to change everything because suddenly Hollywood producers began to realize, I don't have to run my movie in the Loop anymore. I can open it up, you know, in Aurora or Naperville or Evanston or some other suburb, and it's going to do just as well as if I open it up in the Loop. So very rapidly, between 1974 and 1975, a lot of the big first-run movies began to open up into suburban theaters and not into downtown Loop theaters. And as a result of that, the downtown Loop theaters often got the garbage. Right? They began to get the movies that nobody else really wanted. For example, this classic, Abby. All right? This was kind of an African-American themed kind of ripoff of The Exorcist. It actually did really well, all right? But this was the type of movie that you weren't going to see, you know, out in Lombard, all right? But it's a movie that, you know, that would play to African American audiences, you know, in the loop. Now, I've talked enough. Are there questions? Yes?
You mentioned how you interviewed and were exploring all sorts of minority groups.
Yes.
And obviously the Black situation is unique to this time period, but were there other minority groups, ethnic or otherwise, you mentioned homosexuality, that there was some overlap or some similar situation?
Not that I've really found. If you were younger and white and living in the city, you weren't as fearful of going to a lot of these theaters that maybe people from the suburbs were. Yeah, but not large ethnic enclaves, no. Any other questions? Yes?
They were doing well with these African American audiences. Why did they eventually close?
Because beginning in 1973, and this is, I need to talk about this because it's kind of convoluted. The Daley administration, real estate developers, and the State Street Business Commission began a very concerted campaign to try to eliminate these theaters. They were very fearful of the large black presence in the area. They thought it was really destroying business. And so therefore, it took them a period of time to eventually do this. It took most of the 1970s to be able to do this. But this has ramifications today. For example, let me back up here a little bit. Oh, now it's frozen on me. Does anybody know what Block 37 is? Okay. Block 37 is like got a big mall downtown. That's where a lot of these theaters used to sit back then. Even today, even though it was proposed more than a decade ago, there is no movie theater in Block 37. I think that's from what I can gather, and that's because Daley's son also fought not to have a movie theater in that area, kind of vestiges of what had happened in the past. Yes?
Do you think it made an impact on the way the white people thought about the African Americans, by the theaters playing African American movies, and then the next week playing porn, and then the next week playing another African American movies, whereas the white theaters were staying away from that kind of trash?
Absolutely. It gained the reputation, and it all became mixed and muddled together. It became a place that was not reputable. All right. They showed pornography. They showed these violent black-themed films. It's not a place that you're going to take your children, and it's certainly not a place you're going to take a date.
Which intensified connotations on the black people, because now that's the image that they were projecting.
Absolutely. And conversely, when large numbers of African Americans began to see The Exorcist in some of these suburban theaters, that was very fearful for a lot of white suburbanites also. Yes?
I saw on the map that in that area, I know that this is true for the Oriental, that area's got a lot of just like stage theaters now. I know the Oriental is now, you can see musicals there. Was there, I just thought it was interesting that where there used to be movie theaters, there's now dramatic theaters. Is there any, did that tie into the effort to remove movie theaters, replacing them with?
Well, you know, both the Chicago and the Oriental Theater were ready to be bulldozed. All right. We are incredibly lucky that we still have either of those theaters today, because it was on the books that those were the next that were going to go, and it was only when historical preservationists made a real last-minute pitch to try to save them by arguing that they were historically significant that anything took place. And that's why the Chicago and the Oriental eventually ended up being saved. And the Michael Todd and the CineStage, they reconfigured into the Goodman. But it is interesting why it took such a long period of time for a movie theater chain to come back to the downtown area. Yes?
Do you think the severity of the overall theme of segregation in movie theaters is as prevalent today as it was then? Like you said at the beginning, Tinseltown and Randall have, for the most part, different audiences. Is this still
I think this is kind of very geographically specific, right? I'll give you an example. I'm from Kansas City. 5 or 6 years ago, large numbers of African American youth began to go to a certain theater in an upscale area, and suddenly that area had a rule where they did not allow any patrons under the age of 18 after 7 o'clock at night. So yeah, I think it's very geographically specific. You see this in parts of New Jersey and New York. So I think this is a pattern that's repeated in a lot of other cities. Yeah, Susan.
You gave some very specific reasons related to Chicago for why this happened. And Chicago's downtown is kind of unique and it's so contained and relatively small. How did this play out in a place like, say, New York City? Did you get any inkling of that in your research? Was there a similar phenomenon? It's so different geographically and spatially.
Well, New York's kind of unique in itself. I didn't spend much time in New York, but I think you can compare it to other cities like a Kansas City, a St. Louis. There are similar patterns there where they would have these big, huge, grand theaters, and then suddenly they began to fall apart. So.
I'm wondering if the same thing happened in downtown Aurora. I'm not sure. My memory is dim, but I have this idea that some theaters downtown, and so forth.
I've been so wanting a student to do their senior thesis on that. Really, so wanting to. Yes.
So I see on some of these ads that the theater is open at 7:30, 8:45. I don't know if the movie culture was different then, but also with regards to sort of fear of these black spaces by white people, was there sort of when the sun went down and a crowd came out at night, was there a different theater crowd then, or did they become black spaces in certain times of the day? Or was it like just all?
No, I think by 1971, 1972, if you were white and you worked in the Loop, you went home at 5 o'clock, right? Unless you were young and maybe taking a date there. So it started to become an African-American entertainment venue. I think that's what it became associated. You brought up something interesting, though, like who in the world would want to go to a movie at 7:45 in the morning? If you're homeless, you do. It was a place that you could get out of the cold. So, I mean, that is kind of another reason why maybe you might want to go to these theaters. Yes, John.
Gerald, this is a question in general about films. And it seems like the price of films are going up. And Nextscapes or the internet, I think this past year on the Global Awards, we had an online movie, a global. And we have also today we got more online movies. So you see things changing in terms of less theaters and more people looking on the internet.
John, I have no idea how to predict that. It is interesting, though, because during this period of time in the Loop, movies actually went down in price because a lot of the theater goers got desperate and would do anything. They would double bill, triple bill movies in order to bring people in.
Okay, to go back on your theme, did the films department, theaters down in Chicago ever get into the series of Billy Jack in terms of,
Yeah, but you know what? They weren't very popular, and they didn't play very often. That tended to be more of a suburban phenomenon. That's interesting, though. Interesting question. Yes?
What sparked your interest? How did this become the topic of your third book?
Because I wanted to know what happened to all these theaters. And it kind of went out of control from that point on. So, I mean, I had no idea that this was all about race. When I started this, that was not what I was looking for. I had no idea. And then I started finding all the documentation by the State Street Commission and some of the developers, and I realized,
Just looking at the evolution of theater in Chicago.
yes, I was going to write a book at when these movie theaters closed and why. No idea it was about race. Yes?
What about the ones, though, that were outside of the Loop per se, like the Marina City Theater?
Mm-hmm.
And those, was that just because they were so far removed from?
Well, and I had to kind of separate what movie theaters I was going to deal with and which I weren't. The marina theaters actually didn't exist very long. I thought they existed far longer than they did, but they only lasted for about 10 or 15 years, and then they were over with. Because there were a lot of other movie theaters, like the Playboy Theater was quite interesting, the Esquire, and often they began to take a lot of the first-run movies away from the Loop. So what happens is, between 1975 and 1975, North Michigan Avenue becomes the place to go, no longer the Loop. That becomes the white alternative for safe shopping in the early 1970s. Yes?
You mentioned the rats in the theaters. Were those primarily in the African American? The movies that showed the African American movies, or were they?
Those were just kind of all over. Yeah. Yeah, it was it's like no matter who I interviewed, they talked about that. But I mean, and that's a sad case because the theater owners could have done something about it, but it's kind of like they didn't care enough about their audience to do anything about it. Yes, Mark?
I'm wondering, so I mean, I grew up in the 80s, and I always, as long as I can remember, knew who Shaft was. And now I'm trying to figure out why I knew that. I have no idea, so aside from the wild theme song. But I'm wondering, after these movies premiered in the Loop, did some of them make it out to the suburbs in primarily white regions? I mean, could you go see Shaft at a
You could.
primarily white theater? Was Shaft one of the only films that was like that?
You were more likely to see it at a drive-in, and there were drive-ins all over Chicago in the early 1970s. But the big movies, like a Shaft, like a Superfly, you could also see in suburban areas. But that's often like 2 months, 3 months after it first played, after it's lost a lot of its heat. So, yes, Heidi?
You mentioned North Michigan Avenue kind of being where the whites then could go.
Mhm.
And it reminds me of that thing that was in the news a couple of years ago about the black gangs on Michigan Avenue. Do you know what I'm talking
Yeah.
about? And it reminds me of that same fear of young black crowds in what's considered a white space. Would you say that?
And I actually have that in a footnote. You're exactly right, because I was writing that part when that began to happen. So, yeah. Yeah.
Which theaters had The Exorcist? Which suburbs?
Oh, now you're asking me.
Yeah, sorry.
All right, I would say I've got to go back. No big movie theaters you've ever heard of, I think. So, yeah.
Oak Brook. Wasn't it Oak Brook?
It was. Yes, that is right. That is right. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. I appreciate it.